What's up guys, Magnolia Mo here and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about Audyssey Dynamic EQ and the Audyssey Dynamic EQ surround level compensation, which was added to Marantz and Denon AVRs and processors in July of 2025. I was not aware of this update. I never saw it, that my Denon had been updated with that until I was messing around with the menus recently and I came across the Audyssey Dynamic EQ surround level compensation. So I've done a video previously on Dynamic EQ and what Dynamic EQ pretty much does, right, for Audyssey. And that video is dated. It's a little hard to watch. So this will be an update to that video. What is Audyssey Dynamic EQ? Audyssey Dynamic EQ calibrates the sound of your home theater to achieve a high quality perceived surround sound. In general terms, Audyssey attempts to maintain that surround richness as you go down the volume dial by compensating the bass output, your mid-range and your highs in your surround speakers, not as much in your front stage, but mostly focused on your surround stage, right? So previously, if you had a Denon or a Marantz, there was just, one setting for dynamic EQ where you could turn it on and then you could offset the compensation by, it would start at 0 dBs, then you can offset it by 5, 10, and 15 dB, and it would affect the overall sound. The idea behind it is essentially at lower volumes, you can still get a good surround immersion, I guess, and then good decent bass output. You don't have to be at that reference 75 dB level or around there all the time, right? So if you don't use dynamic EQ because you always watch over the 75 dB reference level, then dynamic EQ is not going to do much in your situation, right? But if you want to listen to it at lower levels, that's when dynamic EQ is important. Personally, I don't use dynamic EQ, but this setting, right, this update to the surrounds, right, is interesting, right? And I wanted to actually take a look at what it's doing and show you guys what Audyssey is actually doing to your calibrated setup, essentially, when you engage the various settings within the dynamic EQ and the surround level compensation. I am going to use my OmniMic software and my OmniMic. If you guys have REW, you can do the same within REW as well. No issues with that also. All right, so again, let's get started. Okay, let's take a look at the actual update on my Denon X3800 within the Audyssey and the dynamic EQ section of the menu. So we're going to go into Audyssey. I use the Multi-EQ X32 reference calibrated setting. You have the dynamic EQ option right here. It's currently off. When I turn it on, then I will have the additional choices, right, to pick from for reference level output and the new surround level compensation. So with dynamic EQ on, I can select reference level offset of 0, 5, 10, and 15 dB. And then the surround level compensation heavy, this means the default setting where surround and rear channels are increased in level up to 8.5 dB based on the master volume when dynamic EQ is on. Then for the medium setting, the level is up to 5.6 dB based on the master volume. And then for the light, it is increased by 2.8 dB. So that was it for the new menu. All right, so here is the OmniMic acoustic measurement tool. I'm going to start with the left speaker first and show you guys how dynamic EQ actually works. And then we're going to move on to the Audyssey Dynamic EQ surround level compensation. Okay, so first, this is just plain dynamic EQ. All right, so let's add the left speaker. This is no dynamic EQ versus dynamic EQ with the 0 dB offset. Okay, I would say the real differences start to show up after 350 hertz or so, right? But I think up to 500 hertz or even lower, 600 hertz, there is no difference in the two curves, except this is the Audyssey roll-off With dynamic EQ engaged, that roll off is gone. It's pretty much, you know, straight, and then starts to roll off at about 14.21 kilohertz. In full honesty, I've tested my ear. I can't hear anything beyond 11 kilohertz, right? So this is kind of useless for me anyways. But I digress. As you can see, you know, with dynamic EQ, that roll off is gone, but everything else is pretty much the same. The main differences start to pop up after 500 hertz, and this becomes more of a house curve. Okay, I'm gonna repeat that. This becomes more of a house curve, because if you have direct live, or if you design your own house curves, you know, it's pretty much, you know, you want more energy in the low frequencies, right? And then you want the gradual taper off, or gradual roll off as you get into your mid bass, and so on and so forth, right? So this almost acts like a house curve, the dynamic EQ, but it's not affecting your surrounds. If anything, it's actually taking off that roll off that Audyssey has. So this is with Audyssey Dynamic EQ engaged at a 0 offset. I'm gonna add the left speaker 15 dB offset, and you can see the 15 dB offset again. This starts to become closer at the high frequencies to that Audyssey roll off, but again, no changes. And then it's not as steep of a, you know, or as dynamic as it typically is at that 0 dB offset. At the peak, which is at 27 hertz, right? Thereabouts 27 hertz. We are looking at 78.9, so that's a 79 dB here, and then 27 hertz, 66 dBs right here. So 13 dB offset, right? So it's boosting it by 13 dBs, which is significant, and as I mentioned, it acts like a house curve. But at that 15 dB offset, the same 27 hertz is 72.4 versus 66. So it's still significant, but it's about 6 dB difference. The main difference, if I remove the 15 dB offset, is the 0 dB dynamic EQ. It almost acts like a house curve. But just turning on dynamic EQ doesn't do anything to this to the overall high frequencies. So I'm okay with this, by the way. I actually like the sound this way. But the only caveat is if I keep increasing the volume, if I go beyond the 75 dB, or the higher I go on the volume dial, this offset, or this difference, starts to negate itself, right? But that's the purpose of dynamic EQ. All right, so I'm going to remove all of these. Now let's look at what the hell is Audyssey doing to my surround speakers, right? So I'm going to use the surround left. No dynamic EQ, and I'm going to start with dynamic EQ at 0. Same thing as what we saw with the fronts, right? No difference in your mid-range, in your mid-bass. It starts basically around 500 hertz, and then you see that gradual increase, almost behaving like that house curve. I'm going to add the 15. I can do the 5, 10, and 15 so that you guys can see all of those. Nothing, you know, as you get higher from offset perspective, you know, from 15, 10, 5, right, your highs start to roll off after that 10 kilohertz, but not, you know, nothing major there, but nothing's happening in your mid-range at all. Mid-bass starts to see some differences, and then you have your 0 dB offset, you have your 5, 10, 15 dB right here. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna now show you something that's gonna come as a huge surprise, right? So I think this is a very good update, by the way. So now for this one, I'm gonna use no dynamic EQ, 0 dB offset, which is your basic, your starting point of your dynamic EQ. But then I'm gonna add that surround compensation level, right, of heavy in here. This is no dynamic EQ right here. As you can see, with dynamic EQ engaged with 0 dB offset, there is the difference right here. And then with the surround level compensation, you are actually getting a boost in your surround speakers as far as your mid-range, all around, like mid-bass, your mid-range, your high frequencies, and then the brilliance aspect of the frequencies, right? So everything's got a lot more. I didn't like this, right? It just sounds unnatural to me. Everything was just too boosted. I'd rather have the dynamic EQ with just simple, the zero offset to give me more bass and more low frequency effect than pumping up the trims for all of my surrounds by, take a look at this, at 10.56 kilohertz. So let's just stay at 10 kilohertz. 10 kilohertz, 71.8 dB versus 64.8 dB, right? So it's almost 7, almost reaching 8, and that's what it's supposed to do at that heavy setting. It will boost your surrounds by up to 8.5 dBs, I believe, 8.5 or 8.2 dBs. So that's a significant bump. Then as you get closer, or actually let's just look at the 1 kilohertz range, same thing, 77 dB at 967 hertz. And 71.7 dB at 967 hertz. Again, that's about a 6 dB bump right there, right around 1 kilohertz frequency. And then if I look at 80 hertz frequency, this is where I think you have the most. At the 80 hertz frequency, you are at 78.1 dB versus 66.5. So that's 12 dB bump or rise. That's why I think I just found it too, almost to a point where it was muddy, right? Maybe at a lower volume it's good, but not, if I'm listening to or watching a movie at 75 or at that reference level. It doesn't do much in the low frequencies, right? It's very little difference. The difference is after 50 hertz, from 50 hertz and onwards is where you see that major increase. So if I were to do dynamic EQ 0 at the light compensation, this is the light. So this is actually better, right? It's not boosting my surrounds a whole lot, just a little bit. The bass remains about the same, right? It's not actually bumping it more in that 80 hertz range, as I mentioned earlier. So it's tracking fairly close, maybe a couple dB increase here. That's not so bothersome in my opinion, right? So to recap, you have your left surround, no dynamic EQ. Then you have your left surround, dynamic EQ turned on, behaves like a house curve. And then left surround, dynamic EQ with the heavy, which is too much, or the light. I almost prefer the light over the heavy. Heavy is just way too much, too powerful in the surrounds. I'm almost afraid it's going to damage my speakers. But this is what I prefer, so I will remove the heavy, and here you go. So dynamic EQ on with the zero offset, not a whole lot of difference in the bass frequencies, and in your mid-range, your mid-bass, your highs are they track slightly better, right, than your 0 dB offset, right, because they do get boosted by a couple dBs here and here all throughout. So it's a little bit more engaging in my opinion. So just to summarize again, I get questions all the time about, do I like using dynamic EQ? My answer has always been I don't like using dynamic EQ unless it's late at night, and I like to use it with dynamic volume when everyone's sleeping in the house and I don't want to disturb anyone. But when I'm purely watching a movie with friends and family, I will not have dynamic EQ on. I'm just going to pump up the volume to wherever I need to be. So for Blu-rays, I'm going to be between 10 and minus 15 dB. For streaming, I'm going to be anywhere from 0 to maybe 5 or 6, minus 5 or 6 dB, but without dynamic EQ. But this, to me, I think This is giving me a whole new option here with the dynamic EQ, not with that surround level compensation, because that's, I think, too much, but just dynamic EQ, because now it's not messing with my surround speakers, right? It's only boosting or adding the bass in, low frequencies, mid bass, and the bass area, right? Which is almost acting like a house curve, right? So I'm going to have to now watch movies with that setting on. I know if I'm going to be pumping up the volume, the closer I get to the reference, the more it's going to get negated, I guess, the effect, right? All right, guys. Have you tried the new dynamic EQ functionality on your Marantz and your Denon receivers? Or like me, were you oblivious to the fact that that update, was released in July? Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are about the surround level compensation feature. If you like it, if you don't like it, if you hate it, whatever the case is, leave me some feedback, some comments. And as usual, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.